Good afternoon and welcome back to Dynamics 365 Finance and Operation. We are working with the module Human Resources. And if this is the first time you stumbled upon the videos, then do make sure that you go back. Quite a few videos that I've created. We actually started our journey with the configuration pieces. We've talked about different setups that are involved in order for this module to be functionable. And in my previous video, we started moving into business processes. So for instance, how you create an employee and some of the fields that are applicable when you create an employee. So we talked about the profile piece of it, and today we're going to move on to the work history. And as you could see, this is an employee record. We know the employee name is Kathleen. Their personnel number is here. We could see that this employee is active within uh, the legal entity USMF, and USMF is what I have been entering as I have entered, and they're active in Contoso Entertainment Systems, Germany. So actually, I can access this employee in USMF. So it looks like that they're being paid by the Contoso Entertainment Systems Germany, whereas because it's a shared parameter or shared form, I can view their information from a different legal entity. So let's go right into the work history piece. So right underneath the summary, there is an employment start date. And if this employee is active, then you could see that the employment end date is never. So if there is an end date to an employment, then at a point when that date kicks in, the employment and their employment for this employee would end, and this employee would no longer be active. It will go into the past worker. So we'll talk about that at some point down in the future. And if you were to expand, or if this employee actually had more than one employment across the organization, so multiple employments, as in terms of seasonal employees, that's what I've seen the most in my implementation. So you'll see a whole list of different kinds of employments for this employee. And as you could imagine, the last day worked is basically in relevance to the employment end date. So when we terminate an employee, we'll see how this last date worked gets populated, but it is basically the date, that termination date, and the last day work date is the same. Uh, they can be different, of course, depending on the business processes. So last date work can be changed and can be different than termination date. But when you select, or when you click on the termination up on top, and you click a termination date, last date work, it gets auto-populated based on the termination date. And then, of course, you can always update the last date work based on the actual business process that you have for your clients. Termination reason. So we talked about the reason code. So here, as you could see, that these are the terminations that are applicable to, these are the reason codes that are applicable to termination. And so if you were to go back to one of my videos where we talked about the reason codes in the setup, we talked a little bit about how you can make a specific reason code appear in a drop-down menu, and this is where this falls in. So that configuration kind of fits in here very nicely. And probation period, so it has no relevance to any of the processes. For instance, I've seen in quite a few of my implementations where you would put this probation period, like for 3 months, for instance, this employee would be on probation, so you cannot enroll them into a benefit plan until that probation period ends. Unfortunately, this is a field for reference only. That is for the HR manager to simply know that this employee is on probation or when their probation will end, and it has no governance around the benefits or the compensation or anything that would require a probation period to be effective from a business perspective. So it's basically just a calendar field for reference only. And the adjusted start date, nothing that I have actually used personally, because I haven't had a client where they would say that the employee will start on one day, but for whatever reason, they might have started on a different day. So that field can be used, it's available, but you just want to make sure that when you do your reporting or whatnot, this is what you also consider. Otherwise, your implement start date would be something that would show up if you're running specific set of reports to see or calculate anniversary dates and whatnot. Okay, so moving on to the employment details, we talked about employment category. So that is also a piece of configuration that we've learned in a few of my videos. So if you see the drop-down menu is full-time, part-time. So if you want to know how to configure, make sure you go and look for a video called employment category. Same thing with the employment type. So it's a drop-down menu, either hourly or salary employment type. So you can select either one of those. And this actually plays a bit of a role in the benefits module as well. So it's very keen to know how you configure how this can be played in the benefits module. So I've seen quite a few implementations and clients who utilize this because full-time employees, for instance, can have a different set of benefits compared to part-time employees. Status. This status is unfortunately for reference purpose. This is something that I've given an idea to Microsoft that this needs to get integrated with a bigger process. For instance, if I have selected none and this employee is active and I run business processes like benefits or compensation or even talk about the uh, variable compensation, the status has no relevance, unfortunately, and which is a huge gap in my eyes. So I have actually sent out an idea to Microsoft, and it's just a matter of how many people actually like that idea, and then it gets voted, and of course, then it gets put into their pipeline in terms of fixing that or implementing the idea. So from an HR perspective, I would like Microsoft to make this integrated. So for instance, I hired an employee. So I created a new employee, hired them for an employment for a position. The status should become employed automatically. That is how it's supposed to be, and that's what it doesn't do. And when I terminate an employee, for instance, as of now, if I terminate this employee, keep the status employee, it should turn into terminated, but it doesn't do so. So I have to manually go into the system, into the rec itself, and change the status just to avoid having this status being part of other processes. We've actually created our own custom statuses and built a process around that. So if this was ever integrated automatically, it would have saved so much of the integration pieces and so much of the development that we had done as a team for other clients. But anyway, the status is basically a standalone, unfortunately. Moving on to the employment notice. So employment or employer unit, week or monthly, it's not something that I've used personally. I don't really know the relevance of this. Maybe it is for a US entity mostly, but at least from a Canadian perspective, we haven't really used the employer unit or the employer quantity for that matter. So I haven't personally seen any of these employment notice being part of the bigger processes that I have implemented for human resources. Benefits, we'll talk a lot more about benefits. It's a huge module, brand new module that was released a few months ago. So just from the perspective of employment or employee record, payment frequency, you should be configuring a payment frequency. We'll talk about how you configure it, but this is a mandatory field. Otherwise, you will not be, at least this employee will not be allowed to enroll into a benefit. So they'll be ineligible for it. So you always need to have a payment frequency. Whereas the calendar piece plays a role with the leave of absence. So if you assign a calendar to this employee, then or all employees for that matter, then their leave of absences are captured accurately, and they also show up in the manager workspace where the calendar is, where they can at least see who has requested, who has it approved, and whatnot. So all the managerial things that requires for a resourcing perspective is also taken into account. So this calendar is pretty useful in that sense. So with that, I think I'll stop our conversation at the employment details, and we'll start talking about the financial dimensions and the benefit details for employee record. So stay tuned for that.